Hello, this is Cory Endrulat. I figured let's do a podcast talking about my approach. Now, I don't intend for people to understand the concepts that I introduce necessarily right away, and I don't think anybody should when it comes to new information. It is something that requires an amount of personal discovery in order to understand, and so it's a matter of guiding the individual in their own direction for their own truth here, because life is one big learning lesson. We all will learn it either way, one way or another, but it's a matter of how we go about in learning that process and living that process of learning itself that constitutes this life. As living is to be of life, right? And we want to be of life, to be living. And we need to know what that life is. We need to understand that life in order to do the best of our living. And of course, I use different analogies. I have different ways of approaching things. I don't consider myself a normal thinker uh, like the average person. I think differently, and I embrace that. That doesn't mean that I will agree with everybody or can understand their perspectives when they deliver to me, as I've always been an observer. So that means when new information has come to my attention, I have time to reflect upon it myself before coming to a steady conclusion. I look at many different sides, different angles. I do my own research, whether that be internal or external, on the internet or not, to come to conclusions. And I encourage people to do the same, not because their thought processes are the same, but because this sort of type of reasoning, which may align much with the trivium process that Mark Passer describes and others, can really help us critically think. But I do think that thyself is an important part of this process, and it cannot be forgotten. Another thing that shouldn't be forgotten when it comes to my approach, but among the approach that I take based on the idea that nature is the answer, is that nature is the answer. Not me, not my approach, not my ideas, not my perspective. None of that is the answer, but nature itself. That can be difficult to understand considering the fact people always want to deliver information through the sense of word of mouth, through the sense of human communication. That is how this knowledge is traditionally passed, but it doesn't mean that's how the knowledge is traditionally attained or traditionally understood. For a deep understanding of natural law or any of its contents really requires that personal journey. Not just a learning lesson, but a journey, because you have to experience it too. And as my friend Aaron Butler says, there's experience and experiments. As someone of the inventor-like mentality, as I've always been, I've always conducted experiments. I don't expect everything to go perfectly, but nonetheless, I still move forward, knowing that I may not have the perfect content. For example, in the beginning of my YouTube channel, I did health videos. I just did it. I knew I had to get my voice out there somehow. I knew that there was valuable things in what I was saying, and I knew that I was going to be shy on camera. I knew that I wasn't going to deliver things on camera the way I would in a conversation between peoples, because of course that is most natural. So you can expect the same for yourself, let's say if you're making new content and so forth, and you shouldn't be afraid, because if you grow courageous over time it becomes easier. Making videos for myself has become easier. What is not necessarily easy, as of when I speak of this right now, is necessarily talking to people on the internet, as I'm used to talking with people in real life. And when you talk to people on the internet about these information, they don't necessarily, they don't see it by surprise. Usually they expect it. And people on the internet, they usually produce content, or they're in those spaces for a certain reason. They like to overcomplexify things. They like to debate upon things. They like to look deep into things and overwhelm themselves, consume themselves in many different regards. Now, of course, there's psychological aspects behind all this as well. But the main point is to understand that human beings aren't perfect, and nor should their ideas, and that we can have a very subjective view of a rather objective reality, and that does not mean that everything that we do is therefore subjective. Because there is a time and place for that objectivity that does exist. And to acknowledge existence, to acknowledge these words, to acknowledge these concepts is to recognize that objectivity, as I've said in another video, as I've said in many different videos at this point. And I can bring to light new ideas and be a messenger, that's all. Because people will, especially good in other ways more than other ways, some people good in other ways more than other ways, will go upon what they themselves are excel at. They will understand it through a unique perspective as well that no one else ultimately understands, shall they ultimately understand it. And I say this all the time, is that this uniqueness and this irony in nature is what allows you to understand everything to the deepest sense. I don't use complex terminology and say, well, this is of the past, and this is of the history, and this is what we know, this is based on this work, this is based on that work. I go based on pure reasoning. And, natural law used to be referred to as the law of reasoning. One thing that I've always noticed within my life that I've always sought to do was reason. And it would perhaps cause some trouble in here and there with people who did refuse to reason. That's not to say I was going super into detail or anything, but I sought resolution. I sought the learning experience out of it. And I sought a sense of common sense, right? Now, there, of course, is also other psychological things that can occur, and we should be conscious of that. We should question ourselves all the time. No doubt about that. And our approach, whether it be mine or yours, shall hold each other accountable by questioning each other and by providing open feedback. So, my approach is definitely not the best, and I'm not claiming for it to be the best. And although I could give tips of advice as to action in real life and to action in the movement, or what have you, natural law, whatever topic you want to talk about, you obviously shouldn't trust me. You obviously shouldn't receive all your information from me. You should look into things for yourself. You should look at the ideas for what they stand themselves. And that should be the prime focus. People's mentalities and such, sure, it can play a role in this world. Of course, that is going to be as the result of certain knowledge that is passed on to them. We've got to be careful of generalizations, of labels as well. There's different phenomenons and dynamics you can get into. But, like I said, to come to the sound, holistic, well-rounded understanding is probably not to have so much going on. And probably to just see life simply because there is so much out there. So that is the conclusion one comes up with over time as the more they study everything, is they start to see more of nothing. Not to say that it is nothing that is everything, because people might get that confused, but rather that it is everything that is really just one something. One something for sure. Not everything being everything and everything just constantly branching and being everything. It gets confusing. That's often the worldview that I see taking place, is the everything of the everything and the description of everything, the detail, the analytics. That, of course, would be expected on an online space, where you're bringing it to people who are used to analyzing, used to debate, used to those type of conversations. And sometimes you really just got to hit it home with the certain simple concepts and really drive away from yourself and the mentalities, but really just the ideas, because that's going to affect the mentalities. Shall they be true? Shall they be important? Shall they be really essential for a human awakening? And so I say that all the time with everything. I say truth rises above. I say, you be the question, but that nature is the answer. So you have to fulfill your role as the question. You're not to ever be the answer or be concluded upon you being the answer or having the answers, but rather that you always point in the right direction, because there is certainly a place where there is answers, and it's not in what we're told those answers are. And those answers, of course, are not to come from authority sources. They're supposed to come from the real authority, nature, the real state, nature, the real naturalization, your birth in nature, not of a certain select boundary, by certain select people, certain select pieces of paper, of legislation, of certain select money and stocks and what have you. None of that is natural, clearly. And we don't have to go through the terms of natural law nor other concepts to understand that nature is the answer as the message that I use, so that is, of course, my approach. I don't always go with that approach, but it should be the approach I go with since it is the one I most can relate to. But of course, that's why I produce videos. That's why I put out solid material, is because then people can look at the totality and there is less interference. For example, in a live stream, it is not the case. There will be interference, and there will be multitudes of different angles that may differ from the tapestry. There may be slight wording issues. There can be many different complications that arise. However, that type of conversation relative to having conversation in real life is still important. People should have conversation, definitely. But when they give up on conversation and they don't want to learn, they don't look into knowledge, then that conversation does not have much worth, does not have much value. And if it's put on certain generalizations and labels, and as a means to disregard it or to provide guilt by association, then it's probably not going to be as impactful as it can be. Nonetheless, sharing ideas, different ideas, is never going to hurt. Sharing knowledge is never going to hurt as much as some might think it does. It doesn't. Because as long as it is knowledge and not deception, then it has worth. And then it has truth. And that could be of the good, it could be of the bad. And as long as you're speaking from the heart, and you always set your intentions clear, I see there being no issue with you being human and making faults. Because as far as I'm concerned, a human, as long as they always stay true to themselves, can always say sorry, can always make an apology, can always fix their mistakes, because they're being themselves. But they're not consumed within thyself, they simply know thyself, hopefully. And of course, that process takes time too. It is not one that is finalized within one reading, one anything. And that one, could you say that comes from any textbook, come from any other source other than nature itself? Can you say that any other source is superior to nature itself? You say many different materials are based on nature, but then nature is still the root material. There's a reason why you have these sets of eyes, a reason why you have your willpower, and I think people should use it instead of keep looking to others to use it for them. That will always be the most learning experience of all regards. So although this perspective is unpopular because everybody wants to push a certain certain ideology, a certain person or whatnot, it is saying that you have power and you should look at your power by all means. Individuality, sovereignty, morality, objectivity, transcendence, mysticism, occultism, consequentialism, natural law, order, right? The natural chaos, and of course living your life is important. You should, when should you not live your life? That is part of nature. That is supposed to be what life is about, not about these other things that we invent that necessarily aren't part of life, but we think is. We think is part of life because we have conditioned ourselves to that being in our life. Does that mean it should persist within our life? That's the room for questioning. It's not me to say exactly what should happen, but it leaves great room for questioning. What is natural and what is unnatural? Again, the nature dynamic. That video I have titled The Nature Dynamic, the most important thing you need to know. I say that for a reason. Because there is nothing more important than understanding what's of nature and what isn't. It's like saying, well, what's of natural law and what isn't. It's like with saying what's natural medicine and what isn't. And then looking at the two, what is and what isn't, and realizing which is of truth and which isn't. Right? Because of which isn't is obviously still taking place within the realm of truth, but isn't meant to be intended for humankind and thus not intended for truth. And this goes for, like I said, natural health is very, very important. You understand the blueprint of the body. I say all the time, natural law helps us understand the blueprint of the world. You can make these connections. This is my approach. This is why I use medical connections to law connections. But you shouldn't be interested in my opinion or my approach necessarily. As I said, you have to find this knowledge within yourself and within the world around you. The same thing goes for your approach then, because that knowledge has to go somewhere, otherwise it's nothing. It lacks meaning. So your approach also has to be unique from you. You have to be yourself, ultimately. You don't want to try to be someone else in your approach. You can see their approach, see how effective as a means it could be, see how inspiring as it can be as a means for you, but don't do it because you're inspired, because they have some sort of viewership, or because of whatnot. Still be yourself and do what you have fun with. Do what makes your heart content. That above all is so, so important. When it comes to conversation, asking questions is important, and not necessarily coming to conclusions. I told you guys in a podcast, perhaps it was unpublished, but I mentioned that as time goes on, I will speak less, because more wise words should be said than unwise words. And there's no need to ramble on for hours when we understand these things in the greatest degrees. Except, of course, I guess in hours in regards to describing things, if we feel the need to describe it, but even then, like I mentioned with my other ideas before, is that description necessary when you are pointing for the way? Okay, go down this way. It's bright, it's shiny, it's got this type of rose petals, it's got this type of dirt, it's got a tree that hangs like this with the shape of this and all of that. You can describe the way, and it might help people so they know what to look out for. But still, even still, is that going to do it? Is that going to be the key in the lock? Well, here's the deal. We all can carry this key, but we're all not the key. And the lock exists. And it's a matter of seeing that lock, because if you don't see the lock and you don't have the key, then either one cannot interact with each other. Both must be seen. If you have natural law, where are you going to put it? The lock and the key is sort of an analogy I may use to describe this connection that you have to make between you and other people, or the natural law in action, natural law in the movement, or any such notion of comparison. There is a matter of the lock and the key everywhere. Can it fit in the hole in the precise measure that it may? Well, there's conditions, there's dependencies involved. Can you formulate the key, meld it to its proper form for that of the lock which is present? This is much akin to the truth being objective and us coming to understand it as well. And maybe it sounds like I'm over-conceptualizing, over-contextualizing, whatever word you want to use, all of this matter as well. But, of course, I do like to think about things. I am analytical. But I have limits to that. I understand not to read too many books because our knowledge should not be so complicated. We have moved away from nature, and we need to recognize that. To move further closer to nature is to not look at so many books, but to understand perhaps the right kind of books. Or not even that, right? Which, okay, the right type of books could be natural law, natural health, or anything regarding nature itself. Not even that, perhaps, however, but maybe there's an extent to living in nature to begin with, observing nature to begin with, observing human behavior in the modern world in relation to nature to begin with, for that speaks of volumes if one has eyes open to see. If you don't see that there is enslavement present, then it's hard for you to come to these conclusions until you can see it in small different ways that maybe you weren't seeing before. Do you notice people's mentalities by their actions? Do you notice that ultimately really speaks of all great volumes? If they're looking at their phones, if they're not looking at the skies, if they're not looking at other people, if they do what the media tells them to do, these are sure signs of a populace that it really isn't not thinking for themselves, or free-minded, free-spirited, to say the least. Because a free-spirited population would be more conscious. Not to say that they shouldn't do these things, but that they would be aware of what is around them, not unaware of what is around them. So to report or be in charge or be responsible for what's happening around them. It seems like people like to avoid responsibility, same as, really, their own security. As everything seems to be handled for them, everybody that I can see around me will just go with the flow. Now, of course, I surround myself by people who don't see that, and they're beautiful people. And this isn't some doom and gloom scenario either. I think it's very empowering. I always have a positive lens to this. People say I'm not as angry as other people when it comes to these subjects. But that's because I am an observer. That means I don't come to necessarily the conclusions that everybody would want me to come to. That doesn't mean I can answer questions the way everybody would want me to. It means that I listen, and I need to listen. And if I don't listen, that is a problem on my own behalf. And I don't necessarily in online talks as much as I do in real life talks, and I don't ask as many questions in online talks perhaps as much as I do in real life talks. I may recognize that because I look through some of my videos, and there is problems to fix there. Online is a different scenario from real life, and I'm coming to understand that world. The reason why it was hard for me to understand is because it is not the natural world. It is a different world of its own. It's imitatively, and that's why some people delve their whole life into the online world. Some of it is very much filling the social gaps for people who don't have social lives in real life. And I am grown used to the technology world as well. But just because we have grown up in such a world, technology is still new. Even if you were born with it since birth, it is still a new thing, and it is still semi-foreign to the human heart as a whole, the human conscience as a whole. Therefore, expect confusion, expect a sense of question among thyself. And I admit to that. I admit to what I don't know. I admit to what I cannot see, necessarily. And online provides many different perspectives that wouldn't be in view if it didn't exist, right? But it is the product of the freedom, the product of existence, the product of seeing things different. And it is something that we will condition to over time, but it's just the beginning of it. It's just the beginning. There's much more to its lifetime, and I don't think we've seen its full potential nearly as much as we can see it. Many people think that maybe we have hit our heights for human technology, but there's more that we can do, and movies are just always a step ahead in that direction. It seems like they always will. Is there a maximum potential that human beings could reach? They'll understand because nature will tell them. But also, depending on the systems that limit that potential, of course, because that's what they do. We would see innovation like crazy if it weren't for some of these systems. I'm referring to, of course, government systems. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure most of you do. By the very nature of it, it limits freedoms. And so, hopefully I didn't complexify things too much, and hopefully I made my approach a bit more clear as to some of the confusions that I will naturally have among this process. That's not to be defensive, it's to speak objectively about my situation and the fact that I can't understand, for example, philosophy or economics or necessarily mathematics as much as I might like those topics when I do study them. It doesn't mean I know all about them. And even somebody who claims that they do would not, because they're man-made materials, they're man-made things. Even people who study the Bible, the same thing. They're reading man-made words on man-made pieces of paper. And despite how much meaning these things can have behind them, economy as well, when it comes to commerce, it is not as easy as grasping the idea of conscience and in general reasoning in the public sphere. Of course, these are all art forms that take time, and I am a young person who does not necessarily know all these things. So I admit that there is time for these things. But that's not to say that I am wrong on some of these issues that I am firmly grounding myself in. And it's not to say I'm in some sort of cult either. It's not to say I am in some sort of dangerous ideology that promotes some sort of knowledge that is so out there. And no, it's none of that. And even if it were out there, which it technically is, that's not a bad thing. Purposefully, to look out there is to actually see potential. And may you see that as some sort of new age view, but to question constantly, to always be in a sense of mystery and feeling a connection with the universe, that is not one thing that is ever wrong to be. Ever. So don't ever forget that. I started this by saying, think and question, always question, and so don't stop. Now you might forget to question people when it comes to talking about these subjects, because some natural habits have brought you toward different ways. That's okay, alright? We have to evaluate our circumstances and find out what is best per situation, per living space. Don't seek my advice. Don't necessarily seek the perfect solution to every perfect encounter. You have to be flexible. In order to be flexible, you are human. In order to learn, you are human. If you were to just receive marching orders all day, you would be a robot, and you would be a slave. So don't expect it from me, just as you wouldn't expect it from the government. Don't expect it from anybody. Because then you're being counterintuitive to the cause, which is freedom, which is to think for thyself, which is to cause controversy, and ultimately, not to 100% really agree with anybody, right? And to see that everywhere somewhere people can be wrong, is to then understand higher and higher truths. One of the main reasons why I talk about natural law, it is a higher truth, a higher law, some people want to call it. And because of how high it is, people are unable to understand it, unless I guess they get high. I mean, literally. By a lot of people, to understand that, they've had to actually get high. So it is up there, and it is something that, because it's up there and people are down here, it's hard for them to look above, because they're so used to looking above, still below, at these kings and queens. But without actually really lifting their head high and above and free spirited to the earth and to the wind, to the spirit, they lack the sense of enlightenment. And I use that term as a means for knowledge. I use it as a means for awareness. So, do you see that light in the dark? Do you see what others do not see? Because then you are among this crowd of innovators and people who really want to change things. If you don't want to change things, then you don't seek this innovation. If you do want to change things and necessarily don't have the same mindset as me, share your mindset with me. I'd be interested in seeing how you interpret things and what your approach is. But ultimately, I would say the coaching approaches are probably the best in conversation with people when it comes to delivering knowledge. Because if you are saying that people instinctively know these truths by themselves, then it's a matter of aggregating thyself in their own understandings of themselves in the universe. So one thing that I have to remind myself of, and you may have to remind yourself of, is to apply these coaching techniques more within your own practice, your own medical practice, your own talking practice. It's all practice. It's all experimentation. It's all experience. And that will perhaps, perfect your approach, per se. It would make sense to me that this would be the case. And let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, wherever you watch this. I appreciate it. This is Cory, Edmund, Endrulat. Nature is the answer.